Hello everybody, we are doing quadratic formula in this video. If you did not watch the other one on simplifying square roots, I do recommend you watch that one first, just to make sure you know how to simplify roots. That way when we do later problems and you have to do that, it just makes a little bit more sense. Because usually that is the problem when I grade things. People will get to the answer, but they won't simplify everything with the radicals. So make sure you understand how to simplify radicals for when we get to this square root part of that number. We'll have to simplify it. In the first part of this, we're actually not going to worry about simplifying it. We're going to be doing something called the discriminant. Boom, boom. In which case, the discriminant is just the part underneath the square root sign in the quadratic formula, which, A, B, and C are just numbers, the numbers in front of this quadratic. When you start plugging them into this formula, you do not use the x. It's just like if b is 5, that's a 5. If this is a 2x squared, you just plug in 2. And it's just a regular formula. You're going to put it here. You're going to simplify it as much as possible. For the most part, we're not really going to be doing decimal approximations. You can just to kind of see what it looks like on a graph, but that's not super necessary for what we're doing. The reason they invented this thing called a discriminant, or at least are drawing attention to it, is because depending on what type of number you get when you do the part underneath the square root, it actually tells you what type of answers you're going to have. And it has to do with, just this. If you take the square root of 7, you get some weird number, but you get a number. You can take the square root of 7. So when you have the quadratic formula here, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, you'll eventually get the square root of some number. So if you get the square root plus or minus, of 7, that is two answers, the plus root 7 and the minus root 7. That is two actual answers. Meanwhile, if you got something like plus or minus the square root of 0, well, the square root of 0 is just 0. And positive 0 minus 0, that's just a single number, 0. Those are the same. So you could have two answers here. This is an example where you get only one answer because positive and negative 0 is the same. Or the other option is you get something like the square root of negative 3, in which case you cannot take the square root of negative numbers. When you simplify radicals, you can make this into an imaginary number, but in terms of solutions or x-intercepts and things like this, that would be no solution because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. And that's what's going on over here. The part underneath the square root is going to be positive, it's going to be 0, or it's going to be negative. There's no other options. All numbers are either positive, negative, or 0. So when you do the part underneath the square root, it is going to be greater than 0, meaning positive. It's going to be equal to 0, meaning equal to 0. Or it's going to be less than 0, meaning negative. Positive numbers, since you can take the square root of, there will be the positive and negative version of that square root. One real solution, because adding and minusing 0 does nothing. And they call that a double root. And two distinct non-real complex, also known as imaginary solutions. So that's when you would have things like plus or minus I root, whatever. Like in the case up here, this would be equal to plus or minus I root 3. So that's what imaginary solutions would look like. Now, when you get to quadratic formula, it's more going to be like 2 plus or minus I root 3 over 7 or something weird like that. That's what they'll look like. But the point is you'll have an I in it for imaginary, which is a complex solution. So here we go. This is words. You can read the words. Basically what happens is before we've done factoring, but factoring means you have to be able to factor it. You can't always factor. Completing the square can be really messy if you're ever starting to get fractions. When you do the whole b over 2 squared thing, if it's a fraction, everyone just kind of hates what's going on. So you can use quadratic formula instead, and it can be used for any quadratic ever. So that's its plus right there. It can be used for anything. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. So first thing we're going to do in these things is to find the discriminant to see how many and what type of solutions there are. So at this stage, you're not solving. You are just literally plugging in. A is 1, B is 2, and C is negative 8. So you get negative B, so 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared. And it's honestly much safer to just square b in your head rather than using a calculator or writing it as 2 squared. Two big things that you'll hear me talk about. That is one of them. When you do underneath here, we are just going to be squaring b in our heads, which in this case is 4. And then minus 4 times a, which is 1 times c, which is negative 8. Like that. All over 2 times a, which is 1. So that's the entire quadratic formula. But as I said, right now, we're just going to be looking at the 4 minus 4 times 1 times negative 8, the discriminant, the b squared minus 4ac, after you do b squared in your head. Because a number squared is always positive. If you use a calculator, you might accidentally do it wrong. But that's what you do. You got here, boom, boom. Since you have a negative, a positive, and negative, 2 negatives make a positive. So that means you will end up with a plus sign, because a negative 4 times a negative 8 is positive. And that's going to be 32. 4 times 1 times 8 is 32. So 4 plus 32 is 36. So the discriminant is equal to 36. That is a positive number. At this point, we really don't care about number 36. We just care that it's positive. Because it is positive, you would go over here and you would say there's 2 real solutions. Done. Not 2 imaginary, not 1 real, 2 real. If it was a negative 36, then we'd have 2 imaginary. But it is positive. Positive is the important word there. There you go. Since we kind of already started, I might as well go ahead and finish this part up. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root. Luckily, we already did this part. It was 36, so I'll just go ahead and put the 36 there over 2, because 2 times 1 is 2. 36. Square root of 36, right there. Don't overthink it. Really, just don't overthink it. What's the square root of 36? That's right, it's 6. So you get negative 2 plus or minus 6 over 2. That's it. Square root of 36 is 6. End of story. No more. Nothing funky. It's just 6. From here, you have 2 options. You can either split it up now and do negative 2 plus 6, get something and divide it by 2. Then do negative 2 minus 6, get what you get and divide it by 2. Or you can actually do the heart technique, which is to divide each of these by 2. And negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. And 6 divided by 2 is 3. So if you split that part up, you get negative 1 plus 3 and a negative 1 minus 3, which is 2 and negative 4. Those are your 2 solutions that you would get through the quadratic formula. As it kind of shows over here by factoring, this one actually is factorable. And I kind of want to show you how much faster factoring is. Quadratic formula will always get you the answer, but sometimes factoring is faster. For instance, start this up. What multiplies to negative 8 and adds up to 2? Multiplies to 8, adds up to 2. Here are your choices. 1 and 8. 2 and 4. And that's it. So which ones get you 2? So we got a 2 and a 4. In order to make this a positive 2, one of them is going to have to be negative, and that's this one. Negative 2 and 4. So it factors into x minus 2 and x plus 4, setting it equal to 0. And if you set each of these equal to 0, you get 2. And negative 4. Which should look somewhat familiar. Yay. You get the same thing. It's just factoring is a lot faster, which is why we learned about it first. Okay. That's the notes. The rest of this is just kind of practice. I'll be honest, I don't really care about the graphs right here. Give these a shot. Just know that it does have to be equal to 0, so this is a thing where you'd have to add 5 to both sides to get 3x squared minus 10x plus 5. Now you can use the quadratic formula. So give these a shot. I'll make another video with the answers. Bye.